Pastor Mark Buchanan writes these words. He says, "In the town where I live, a little girl is dying. Her name is Caitlin. My daughter Sarah attended preschool with Caitlin, and on the days when I picked Sarah up, I would often find her and Caitlin playing together at the swing set, pushing each other in great stomach-fluttering arcs, or in the sandbox, piling pail upon pail of crumbly sand into a kind of replica of the ruined Acropolis. They were two vigorous, joyful 4-year-olds, prankish, coltish, giddy, quick to laugh and dance, cry and sing. Caitlin's mother, Bonnie, came to pick her up one day, and something was terribly awry. Bonnie wrote this to me. Have you ever had a day that you know has changed your life forever? A day that you would do anything to black out and just fast forward past? February 28, 1997, I arrived at the preschool. Caitlin was standing in the playground looking down at the grass. One of her playmates said several times, "Caitlin, your mummy is here." I spoke to her and there was no reaction, so I approached her and lifted her chin up with my finger. When I did this, I realized that something was wrong. Her eyes were vacant, and she had no recognition of me. I immediately called for the preschool teacher, and Caitlin began to waver, and I knelt down beside her and laid her across my lap. The teacher called her name and did other things to get her to respond. Her eyes were open but not focused. They rolled to the right, and she remained limp. The ambulance was called, and I carried her inside and started to lay her on her side. And when I did this, she began to cry and call out for Mummy. The paramedics arrived, and I was holding her and kissing her and weeping, and we were taken to the hospital by ambulance. I was told that she had a seizure, but that she would be fine, and tests were ordered, she wrote. Well, the tests agreed with the initial diagnosis. Caitlin would be fine. But Caitlin wasn't fine. She grew increasingly pale, and her speech started to slur, and she began to fumble things and to stumble often. And she got more and more clumsy, and she couldn't hold things. And she walked into walls and door jams, and she fell down a lot, and her speech worsened. Words started coming out in guttural chunks, in sharp, jagged howls and throaty grunts and mournful groans. And the other 4-year-olds grew afraid of her, and some even made fun of her. The doctor kept ordering tests. And then one day, Caitlin's mother and father got the news that they dreaded and expected. Caitlin is dying. She has Batten's disease, a rare and incurable congenital degenerative neural disorder. Her muscles are petrifying. They are now hard like wood, but they will soon be hard like stone. And they will harden until one day she can no longer swallow or breathe. Caitlin's parents, her brother, her grandparents, her aunts, her uncles, her cousins, her friends, her church family, all watched beautiful little Caitlin die a slow death, and they can do nothing. Caitlin's mother is a Christian and has drenched her bed with tears. She has beaten her fist bloody on heaven's door, trying to get the owner to open up and give her some bread. She attends a church full of godly, caring people, and they pray. And other people at other churches pray. They pray for many things: strength for parents, wisdom for doctors, comfort for Caitlin. But most of all, they pray that God will heal Caitlin. God hasn't answered that prayer yet. And in truth, few now think that he will. What about pain? What about suffering? What about evil? It's a tough question. You know, there was a survey done in the last couple of years where people were asked this. They were asked, if you could ask God one question, knowing that he would give you an answer, what question would you ask? And you know what the top response was by and far? The top response was, why is there pain and suffering in this world? Why is there pain and suffering in this world? And even among Christians, we are known to struggle with the question, why does God allow pain and suffering and evil in this world? Why does he allow it to continue when he can supposedly take it all away? If he is almighty and has all power, why does he allow it to happen? That's another tough question. And many of us, in our confusion, in our own pain, in our own arrogance as human beings, many of us draw some conclusions. We look at these situations and we say, well, this God must not care. Or we come to the conclusion that maybe God really can't do anything. Maybe he's not as powerful as he says. Or maybe we say, it just must be God's plan. Must be God's plan that little girls die of incurable diseases. Or it must be God, maybe God just doesn't exist. Maybe he's just a good idea that someone made up. And you know what? I say this with all compassion. If I were someone who was stung deeply in my life, deeply, with pain or suffering or with evil, then I can see how you would be tempted to draw one of these conclusions. If you were hurting so bad, for sure, maybe you would come to that place too. But this morning, I want to help us all to better understand this important issue. And I think our understanding all begins with the idea of free will, of human freedom. I think we need to begin to understand that suffering was never God's original plan for humanity. When God created the garden, he created this incredible opportunity for Adam and Eve to live in peace and live in harmony with him. The Garden of Eden was always meant to be a place like heaven, a place of peace and harmony. But you see, it was Adam and Eve who of their free will chose to disobey God. And it was Adam and Eve who kicked open the door and welcomed sin and sickness and suffering and death into the human experience. Because before they disobeyed God, it was not there. It was not a part of humans' experience. Sure, it existed, but it was not a part of our experience. But they kicked open the door and it came rushing in. And they moved the whole human race, representing all of us today. They moved the whole human race from a place of peace and paradise to a place of life without God. And so why doesn't God just reverse things? Why doesn't God just rewind the clock? Why doesn't God just take away all the evil and darkness and brokenness and pain and suffering? Why doesn't God just swoop in and take it all away? Well, the simple answer is free will. Free will. Free will is the ability to choose among viable options. The ability to choose among viable options. That isn't like what Henry Ford said. Some of you know his quote where he said, you know what, you can choose whatever color you want for your car as long as it's black. That's not free will. There's no viable option. There's no choice to be made. In order for there to be free will, there must be a viable option. And we understand that the viable options, some of them may not be so good. Some of them are great, but some of them may not be so good. But in order for there to be free will, all of the options have to be open to us. And so for God to remove pain and suffering and evil, in essence, would be to take away our ability to choose. You see, free will in itself was a two-edged sword. And we all understand this by the way we live our lives. If you don't, then you're probably hurting really bad. Because free will is a two-edged sword. On the one side, we love the freedom to choose the good things. And we enjoy the blessings when we follow after the ways of God. But on the other side, when we choose the bad, it cuts the other way and we bear the consequences of our choices. And we would all say, yeah, Lord, give me the good in my life, but don't give me the bad. I don't want the bad. But we can't have it both ways. In order for us to have true free will, in order for us to truly choose, we must be free to choose the good and the bad. And so we begin to understand that, you know what? Evil in itself, pain, suffering, all the things that come with darkness, all the things that come with life apart from God, it's a necessary thing for us to have choice. Without it, there is no choice. We're just robots, programmed to live in a certain course. So practically speaking, when we move from here, when we begin to understand how free will works, there are three sources of pain and suffering and evil in our world today. There are three sources. First of all, it comes as a result of our own choosing. Sometimes these things enter our lives as a result of our own choosing. You know, we used to live in this wonderful little home out in Hepworth, Ontario. If you've ever driven up Highway 6 up to Wyerton, you've gone through Hepworth. There's a little Tim Hortons there. That was the claim to fame. And we had this wonderful little home, and we put in this wonderful, it was an old-time wood-burning stove. And it was great. And we think we have long winters here. They're hitting May, and it's still snowing, man. They got snow in the cold. It was cold. Capital T cold. And so we put in this big fireplace, this wood-burning stove. But Wes was only about 3 years old at the time, right? And there were no fences around it or anything. It was in the living room. And we'd stock it full of wood, and that thing would just get pumping. And it was great. You'd be sweating, and it was awesome. I loved it. I couldn't bring it with me, though. So anyway, here's Wes, 3 years old, right? Doesn't know any better. And I'm watching him. He's really interested with this wood stove. So what did he do? Stove on his head. And we told him over and over and over again, don't touch that. Fortunately, he just touched it lightly and he pulled back, and so he burned his fingers a little bit, right? So Nurse Mum was on that. She was all over that, taking care of Wes. But you know what? He never touched the stove again. Never touched the stove again. And there are things in our lives. Truth is that if we violate God's ways, we are pursuing a path that will bring consequences on us. If we pursue things like adultery, we pursue hate, we pursue stealing and lying and rejecting God, we are heading toward an end of pain, of suffering. We have chosen to go down a path that will bring those consequences. If you think that you can pursue those things without consequence, you're deceiving yourself, because you have chosen a course of pain. The reality is sometimes we bring the pain on ourselves. That is one source of suffering in our lives. Another source, it comes as a result of other people's sin. Some suggest that this is the source of up to 95% of the suffering in the world today. We hear of these stories all the time when greed and selfishness lead companies to do horrendous things to the environment, create environmental hazards by which many people get sick and die because of contaminated water or land or whatever it is. Suffering brought on by someone else's sin. We hear of times when hate and confusion brings on war and death and bloodshed and all of these horrendous things. Why? And then we hear about anger and drunkenness and immorality that leads to broken families and terrible pain in people's lives. And there is so much suffering in the world today which simply comes because of someone's choice to pursue a path of darkness that has consequences not only on them, but on people around them. And so sometimes pain and suffering comes into our lives not only by our own choices, but by the choices of people around us. And then there's